If I can begin, if you don't mind, I'm going to start off with a land acknowledgement. I don't know exactly where you're coming from. If you want to acknowledge the land that you're coming from, you can add that into the chat, whatever treaty you may be representing. I'll be reading a land acknowledgement that Tyndale typically uses, and in so doing, just kind of acknowledge where we are and moving forward. For thousands of years, the Greater Toronto Area has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. It is part of the Dish with One Spoon territory, a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that committed them together to share the territory and protect the land. Other Indigenous peoples and nations have subsequently entered this territory in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. And it is on these lands and in this spirit that Tyndale seeks to engage its work. You know, for us, reading the land acknowledgement isn't something that we just feel like that we have to do because we've been compelled to, but we're compelled and inspired to, not just to look to the past, but look to the future in terms of what does it mean for us to walk in right relationship with not just our First Nations brothers and sisters, but also others who continue to come into the land. And even as a reminder to us that all of us, pretty much all of us, have come from somewhere. And so what does it mean for to us to acknowledge those that were here first? And even maybe argumentatively, even the First Nations people came from somewhere. So what does it mean for us to enter in together and to walk right and to acknowledge where we are? You know, 2 years ago when I came and presented, I'm not going to do a massive summary from there, but I'm really grateful to be able to spend time with a number of you who might have been here. You know, back then, you know, I talked about intercultural development as a skill set and a competency for leaders really to work towards and develop on their own with their leadership teams. And that was talking a little bit about diversity, inclusion, moving towards transformation, and a lot of the stage-based training that we do at our center. You know, and in that, you know, when I boil down intercultural competency, you know, I really think about these three spheres. You know, on one hand, there's the cognitive side of just raising awareness of, do you even understand cognitively, knowledge-wise, of the differences between cultures, and then examining your behaviors, the words that you say, the actions that you take, the decisions that are made, that may or may not bring people in. They may actually push people away depending on the action that you're taking. But then finally, that affective side, which is really emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence, you know, I bring up specifically today because when we talk about intercultural competency, working across difference, working with other cultures, sometimes we really need to be aware of, hey, is this situation, is this conversation making me feel uncomfortable? And it's not wrong to feel uncomfortable. It's not wrong to feel anxiety, maybe even fear. But, you know, are you acknowledging that? Are you acknowledging that place of emotion that you're feeling? And then where do you go from there? How do you acknowledge and identify and act appropriately? So even today, you know, as I bring up culture and talk about differences, I want to be at least recognizing that if inside you're feeling like, nah, everything Tim's saying is completely heretical, you know, acknowledge that emotion. You can write to your executive minister later. I'm just joking. But you know, let's wrestle a little bit with some of that discomfort. Let's wrestle with a little bit of that emotion, because sometimes it's only when those emotions happen that we realize, oh, there's actual difference here. It's beyond just something is right or wrong, but hey, maybe this is a chance for me to examine where I am. You know, as we move on, let me take a pause from just talking about content for a second and ask how everyone's Sunday was just 2 days ago. You know, I don't know how your service was. I happen to be leading the music and lead the worship. And I guess because of the time zone difference, if you're leading a church, most of your churches were done by the time you had to turn the TV on. In our church, we had to kind of move swiftly through the service to try to get to 11 o'clock Eastern time so that the game could be on. And most of us probably were watching the World Cup. Perhaps some people didn't even know it was happening. That's okay if you didn't know it was happening. The Canada was playing on Sunday, and many people across Canada, even the Canada diaspora spread across the globe, was probably watching and united for at least the first minute until things kind of fell apart. I hope that wasn't too triggering for people who were disappointed by the rest of the game. But, you know, it's been interesting thinking about the World Cup, you know, on many levels. You know, on one hand, sure, there is this soccer tournament, this football game that is happening, and teams from around the world are coming together. But there's been this kind of sub-narrative happening in the same time in media, in journalism, in discussion. Maybe you paid attention to it, maybe you haven't. And primarily it's been around the nation of Qatar. And Qatar being obviously a different country than ours, with different ways of doing things, different culture, different beliefs, different assumptions that they make, different ways of seeing the world. And on some level, I'm completely on board with the fact that, yeah, there's gender rights, there's human rights that are being more than just stretched. I'll say, I don't want to get too political here, but some challenges that we need to think about. Hey, how different is our viewpoints, and how different are our worlds when we think about cultural differences? And I think that's a good kind of reminder to say, hey, when we think about countries, it's beyond just language, it's beyond just the food that we eat, but there's something culturally different. And so how do we think about those things as we dig a little bit deeper? On some level in the media, it's been portrayed as just conservative versus liberal, and the two sides. Well, the West is much more liberal and progressive, and that's why the conservative, other places of the world, they just got to get with the times. But on some level, when you just think about it on these conservative and liberal polarities, that's kind of oversimplifying a discussion that's way more nuanced than that. And it's very unimaginative, uncreative and overly simplistic to think that it's just about a right and a wrong, or a left and a right conversation. There's much more deeper going on inside. When I think about this conversation and I think about Qatar, and the World Cup, I mean, obviously it makes me think about not just the migrant workers that are there, but the world coming together, and people truly, honestly on the move. And so, I just want to kind of put out there, how big of a deal migration is right now. Global migration is a global reality that we just have to really acknowledge. The number of international migrants since the year 2000 has grown by 49%. Now, these are pre-pandemic numbers, so I don't know how much it's completely changed since pandemic. But that's a massive change. Since simply the year 2000, 49%, there's been a 49% change. And that's massive. That's a massive amount of people. When we put it into terms of actual numbers, from the year 2000 to the year 2015, the global numbers of refugees and international migrants has grown about 70 million people. 70 million people. That's a lot of people. I mean, already 172 million people in the year 2000 as migrants, people who are existing and dwelling and living in a place that is not where they would call home or where they were born, to 243 million. That's a huge increase in just 15 years. And a significant amount of them are refugees, of course. When I think about international migration and global diaspora, people on the move, sometimes we just think about our own neighborhood and our own area, which is legitimate and important. But what we do need to be reminded of is that when we think about global migration, people are literally moving from everywhere to everywhere. Oftentimes we'll think to ourselves as North Americans, oh, everyone's trying to come here. I'm sure there's a lot of people trying to come here, but people are going from everywhere to everywhere else. Canada's up in the upper right corner there. If you can actually read, sorry about the small print, you can find this on United Nations website. Actually, just basically borrowed it from there. But what it shows is the millions and millions of people that are coming from every country to every other country. When you look at people from India, the greatest amount of people from India are actually going to the United Arab Emirates. They're not all coming to Canada. Many are going to the United States, but the greatest percentage of Indian migrants are actually moving to the United Emirates. And so that is almost just as a reminder of, hey, global migration is not just a North American conversation. It's not just a Canadian conversation. This is a global conversation in terms of trying to figure out movements of people from every continent, from east to west to north to south, every country and every place that we are in. As Christians and as believers, obviously, there is foundation for people on the move. There is biblical reference from Genesis to Revelation. Genesis 12, obviously, thinking about Abram, and moving into his new name Abraham. Even before Abraham's time, he was already a person on the move. His family was already on the move. They were called to move to another place. When we think about the story of Ruth, who took up the identity and made sunk in roots into a new land, God's people were in exile for literally centuries. And so this idea of migration is very much a biblical picture of what was happening historically, and even as we think about today. Jesus himself was a refugee. If you look at Matthew 2, he didn't move to as an international student or something, just trying to get a job. No, he was moving as a refugee because of the context and the historical perspective and geopolitical situation that was happening. His family were on the move and had no home. And then we think about the book of Acts, obviously, and the idea of the scattered people. And that word diaspora actually comes from the word scattered. Diaspora is not just a biblical term today. It's actually used quite a bit in academia. So that word diaspora, I actually have grown to love more and more, whether you say diaspora, diaspora, whatever it is. We'll often talk about the African diaspora, the Chinese or Sinophone diaspora. And so what do we think about when we think about people who have been scattered, but perhaps have an identity that is far from their home? When we think about migration, I do want to touch a little bit on international migration. And when we think about it, there are push and pull factors. So there may be a push factor that is pushing someone or a group of people away from a region or a country. But then there are pull factors in terms of, well, why are they being pulled or drawn to a certain other region? And so both factors are very important and key. So for example, it's no wonder that there's actually quite a bit of Cantonese Chinese immigrants in Canada, primarily because many of them came from Hong Kong. And Hong Kong, was a British colony, and Canada was a British colony. And so there was that pull factor of Cantonese immigrants coming to Canada, whereas percentage-wise, there has not been that same significant immigration from Hong Kong to the United States, for example. And so we think about these push and pull factors being very important to understand the nuanced differences of certain people going to certain places. Breaking that down a little bit more, even so, when we talk about migration, and I'll just focus on international migration here for 1 second. We have to just kind of keep in mind that there's voluntary and then there's involuntary or forced migration as well, which are very, very distinct. So, I'm trying to get across the point that migration and people on the move and diaspora is not all the same. And I think if we end up just blanketing everyone as just the same people on the move, then we forget the nuanced differences of where they're coming from, why they're on the move, their mindsets, and well, how are they finding home if they're even intending to find home? So when we think about international migration, there is a voluntary migration, which may be economic. It may be international students, people who have chosen to go to another place. Maybe they're moving temporarily. Maybe they're moving because they just want a better life in a different place. But on the other hand, very different are forced migration, right? This is when we think about environmental factors like drought or famine, or we think about refugees coming out of war and asylum seekers. So those are very different conversations and very different ministry needs when we think about people that are on the move and how do we approach them and handle them. A quote that I have been thinking about recently that's been around for the last few years is this: migration is not a new problem to be solved, but rather a reality to be managed. Migration is not a new problem to be solved, but a reality to be managed. What I like about this quote is that, it's saying that migration is not this problem that we have to solve and take away. Well, because I don't think anyone's going to necessarily get rid of it, because people will always be on the move. But if you see it just as a problem, then you just see it as something wrong. Whereas it's just this reality that we're in, this reality where people are simply on the move. We too, whether you're first, second, third, fourth, maybe even fifth generation, your people came from somewhere, and that's the reality of trying to figure that out. For me, I'd rather even push that quote a little bit further and actually prefer saying even that it's not even just a problem to be solved, not just a reality for us to manage, but I actually think that this is a divine opportunity. This is a divine opportunity where we are actually connecting with not just our local neighborhoods and the people around us that God has brought, but a divine opportunity where we are constantly connected with people that they too are connected globally. And so you think about that divine opportunity of people that are constantly connected all around the world. I mean, significant stories we'll talk about and hear about where refugees, they're not sure where their next meal is. They don't know if they have a roof over their head tonight, but they'll all have a cell phone and they're all messaging somebody because that's the one thing that they're carrying around from place to place. And so when we start to put flesh and blood around these numbers and these figures, we realize that there are real people with real stories moving all over the world. And I think there's a divine opportunity for us to really think about, hey, what does that mean for us? Not just to reach the nations in our neighborhood, but to be shaped, to be pushed, to be stretched, for us too, to think about, what does it mean to be, to have a global faith and to for the kingdom of God to be here, not just in Atlantic Canada, not just in Canada, but for us to be here and around the world. When I was thinking about global migration a few years ago, it was the peak of the Syrian crisis, and Canada obviously was coming along board, thinking about sponsorship about refugees. Canada as a government, as an institution, said that we were going to take a certain amount of refugees in. And then the church rose up, and many churches said, hey, we too, whether just the people of our church or organizationally, we're going to do this. We're going to sponsor refugees. Thinking about that, it was a little bit of a challenge for our church. Our church is ethnically Chinese, so we have a Cantonese, Mandarin, and English-speaking congregations. And I approached my Mandarin pastor at the time, and I said, hey, what do you think about this whole Syrian refugee and opportunity for us to perhaps sponsor a family? And the Mandarin pastor at the time, he said to me, he looked at me and said, that's a very good question, Pastor Tim, or Reverend Tim. He said, because the title was very important for him. He said, I think that with all these Syrian refugees coming, I think this will dramatically change the religious landscape of Canada. And I said, oh, okay. And I said, hold on. What do you mean by that? Like, I was actually just seeing if he'd be open to us sponsoring and putting some money into, developing a program. And he was very, strong about his thought about this. And I said, well, what do you mean? Like, are you thinking that about the Syrians coming and many of them who are not Christians? And he said, well, obviously, Tim, they're all Muslims. They're all going to come, and that will change, what we're fighting for here in Canada as Christians. And I said, hold on a second. Like, are you saying then, and I love my Mandarin pastor, by the way, so hopefully I'm not throwing him too far under the bus. But I said, are you saying that you're thinking that most of the Syrians are coming and all of them are Muslims? And he said, well, yeah, obviously they are. And I said, well, if I were to suggest to you that many of those Syrian refugees are actually Christians, what would you think? And he said, huh? They are? And I was like, yeah, absolutely. Like, I'm not going to say that they all are, but there was a significant amount of Syrian refugees that were driven from their land who were actually Christians already. And so it wasn't just about them coming and for us to convert them and show them the love of Jesus. But even if they were already Christians, well, what does it mean for us to think about a significant amount of global Christians actually also on the move? And I think that was a reminder to me of how much oftentimes, whether you're a new Christian, like my Mandarin brothers and sisters, or whether you're an old Christian of several generations, sometimes we think as North Americans, Christianity is a North American thing, but it's not. It's clearly not. And when we think about global Christianity, and we think about the world as 100 Christians, we need to have that quick reminder that if there were 100 Christians represented of all of global Christianity, 67 of them, so 67%, would probably live in Asia, Africa, or Latin America, or Oceania, whereas only about 30%, 33% would live in Europe or North America. Like, that's a very significant number, where it's not just a North American situation, but it's a global conversation for us to realize and understand. I will provide a PDF of these slides later for people. So I apologize for the small font. We got to give you guys some bigger monitors so you guys can see everything, right? But I'll make sure I send these slides on to you so you can see kind of the details and numbers. For sure, understandably, why we have this stereotype, because sure, historically, maybe in the last 100 years ago, it was very much a European and North American conversation of global faith. Perhaps, if we look at some of the studies that have gone on over the years, here's a study from 1910 comparing to 2010 of the regional distribution of Christianity. Now, yes, some of the Christianity numbers here include the Roman Catholic faith. So I apologize for those of you who are still wondering about Roman Catholicism and Protestantism, let alone Convention Baptist or whatever it may be. However, with these stats, just looking at 1910, which is the blue bar, and then 2010, so 100 years later, as the orange bar, you see this incredible change from Europe and the Americas, where it was a dominant faith, in Europe, but it dramatically dropped in half in just 100 years later. Compare that to Asia and the sub-Saharan Africa, where the numbers went exactly reverse, doubled, if not tripled, if not quadrupled in terms of number and sheer size. And another reminder when we think about these stats is that the Americas here is not just Canada, obviously. It's not even just North America. The numbers here that are growing and rising from 1910 to 2010 in the Americas is actually most significantly in the global South. It's actually in Latin America. And so when we start thinking about regions and global Christianity, let's move a little past 2010, because now 2010 is kind of outdated numbers. In 2018, this was the global distribution of Christians. Now, again, I apologize. These numbers also include the Roman Catholic Church as well. So take that as you will. But these These are the numbers of Christians that follow Jesus. Now, again, there's also a continuum of, do they go to church every Sunday? Do they try to read their devotional every day? Great variation in there, and we can argue what that may look like. But if you just compare the numbers between North America to South America, or Latin America, sorry, let's say that, 277 million Christians in North America, Canada, US, Mexico. Whereas in Latin America, it's 3 times that number in Latin America. When we think about Africa, it's more than 3 times. When we think about Asia, pretty much every continent other than North America has a greater percentage of Christians, self-proclaimed Christians. Now, sure, there's variation in between what they may look like, what exactly denominational faith that is, but at the very least, we need to recognize as North Americans that we don't own Christianity globally. Sure, we own, our denomination, our form of Christianity, the way we do things, absolutely, 100%. I'm not going to argue against that. But if we want to just talk about people groups that follow Jesus or proclaim to follow Jesus, even if it's just one day a week or one day a year, in terms of global Christianity, we have to come to the realization that as North Americans, we don't have a monopoly on what Christianity is. And so how do we think about that? How do we move that forward? An author, David Cassidy, wrote recently, the average Christian in the world today is a 22-year-old brown female. She has not been to your conference. She has not read C.S. Lewis or Christianity Today. She has not read your blog nor mine, and does not go to Starbucks or care one bit about alternative endings to the Game of Thrones, or if the latest lyric from Hillsongs agrees with our confessional standards. What I love about this quote is just pushing this idea of when we're thinking about the average Christian showing up on a Sunday, sure, you're probably not wrong about your local church, but how quickly we assume that this is what Christians are like all over the world. This is what Christians, look like and represent. And we need that reminder that really global Christianity is not ours. And when we think about that faith, then what is it that we're missing? What is it that we need to learn from a global faith that is active, a God that is active all over the world already? I'm not trying to dissuade missions in any way. Hopefully that's not a message I'm putting here. I think missions and work that we do globally is very important, and so much of what the Tyndale Intercultural Ministry Centers does is rally together collaboration around global missions. But we at least need to change our perspective to think, hey, is it just going from the West to the rest, or is it God going from everywhere to everywhere? And well, what does that mean? More importantly, what I want to kind of drive into today is beyond just the missional perspective of where people should go, where our finances and resources should be spent, but more upon, well, when we think about culture, what does that actually mean? Is it just about language? Is it just about food? Is it just about taste and style of music? That's surely not where I want to land things. Often a lot of the teaching and training that we do, we talk about metaphors around culture, and, the classic metaphor of the iceberg being that, culture, often what we see of another culture is just what we see on top, right? And yet 90% of an iceberg is actually beneath the surface. And so what we see on top oftentimes is, we kind of jokingly say saris, samosas, and steel drums. So clothing, food, and music, right? We just see those things at the top. And those are important things and very much represent other cultures. And yet, if we think of another culture as just that food or just that clothing, then we completely miss the boat on how deep and rich that culture actually is and has to offer. And so what does it mean for us to go beneath the surface, to think a little bit more deeply about, hey, what does culture mean? And especially if we're thinking about a global faith, a global Christianity that is now on our doorstep, because whether you're in a big city or in rural New Brunswick, God has truly brought the nations, right? Maybe not to the same percentage as every single city being the same, but God has brought the nations. And probably during this time of World Cup season, you'll be hearing much more celebrations who are people celebrating not just Canada's one goal, but celebrating the many nations from around the world. Let me play a short clip from a video to kind of illustrate getting beneath the surface of culture. I'm hoping that I think I clicked optimize audio, so I hope it plays okay.
Hey, I'm going to China again.
Oh, that's great. What are you doing?
Well, I'm going to go visit all my relatives in my village.
Okay, do you know what to call them?
Yeah, like, uncles, aunts, brothers, sisters, the usual.
Ha! Let me show you the Chinese family tree.
So here's you. We all know the basics. Your mom is your mama, your dad is your baba, your older brother is 哥哥, your older sister is 姐姐, your younger sister is 妹妹, your younger brother is 弟弟. His dad, your grandpa, is 爷爷, his mom, your grandma, is 奶奶, his older brother is your 伯伯, his older brother's wife is your 伯娘, his younger brother is your 叔叔, his younger brother's wife is your 婶婶. His older sister is your 姑妈, his older sister's husband is your 姑丈, his younger sister is your 姑姑, his younger sister's husband is again your 姑丈. But wait, they have kids too. So your cousins on your dad's side, your uncle's son who's older than you is your 堂兄, your uncle's son who's younger than you is your 堂弟, and if your uncle's son has a wife, then it's your 堂嫂. Your uncle's daughter who is older than you is your 堂姐, younger than you is your 堂妹. But if it's your aunt's son who is older than you, then it's your 姑表哥. Your aunt's son who is younger than you is your 姑表弟. Your aunt's daughter who is older than you is your 姑表姐, and your aunt's daughter who's younger than you is your 姑表妹. Now, to your mom's side. Her mom, your grandma, is your 婆婆, her dad, your grandpa, is your 公公. If she has siblings, her brother is your 舅舅, her older sister is your 姨妈, her younger sister is your 阿姨.
And it goes on and on and on and on. I think Garth is putting forward a motion for mandatory credentialing to have a quiz on this. So just watch out. Hopefully you get your credentials before that happens. I'm just joking. The point of that isn't just how overwhelming those names are. I mean, the point of what was trying to be portrayed was what the girl was explaining to the guy was that each of your relatives have a specific title. Like, they don't just have a name like Bob or Steve or Frank or Stephanie. They have a title, and that title entails and implies that they have a role in the family. And that role is very specific in a very collective way. So, for example, I mean, I have 3 children, and my second son has 2 titles. He has 2 titles in our family, depending on the relationship of who is speaking to him. So his older brother will call him younger brother, so in Chinese he'll say 弟弟, right? And his younger sister will call him 哥哥. And so completely different titles, because he has 2 different roles in the family depending on who you are in relationship to him, right? Which is very confusing because, for a number of reasons, right? But it's beyond just brother. It's, oh, you're my older brother because of this. And in a larger family, it's first brother, second brother, third brother, fourth brother. And each of those roles have a specific role within the greater family. And this is not just to say, oh, how complicated the Chinese family is. It is very complicated. But I can speak from a little bit of expertise around this, because this is how my family is. Yang Liu wrote this book called East Meets West some years ago. She was an international student that came from China. That kind of illustrates more so, hey, how do we look at cultural differences just between East and West, and how do we dig into them? Each one of these slides really is a lecture on their own. But I just kind of want to quickly go through a few of these just to exemplify, hey, there are beyond just food, beyond just language, beyond just music, there are deeper cultural values that when we see things, when we think about things, that kind of go beyond just, hey, a translator, and that we need to go beyond when we think about that. Kind of jokingly, when we think about animals, East versus West, West being the blue and East being the red here. She was observing, I'm not saying this is right or wrong, I'm not saying this is, I'm not just trying to stereotype, but what she was observing, that in the West, typically people see animals and they want to admire their beauty and think about, observe, how they interact and how they sing songs. Whereas typically in the East, and I don't want to stereotype too much, most people in the East think to themselves, I wonder how that tastes, right? And a little bit nuance between countries and cultures. In the West, typically people want to spectate and observe in their leisure time entertainment. They want to watch TV and they want to see and observe things. Whereas in the East, what she was observing was that typically people want to participate. They want to sing karaoke. They want to be part of the entertainment and not just watch it on a screen, which is, slightly difference between the two. Now, these 2 first ones were light and kind of joking, but let me get a little bit more serious here for 1 second, right? In terms of, this is what she's entitled, this is me and my sense of self, right? So in the West, what she was observing was that there's almost like a large sense of self in the West, whereas in the East, there's a very small sense of who I am. Garth was very, very gracious at the beginning, saying the full title of the Tyndale Intercultural Ministry Center. But for the last 20 years, the Tyndale Intercultural Ministry Center has been known as the Tim Center. So it's it actually drives me crazy that I have to introduce myself as Tim from the Tim Center. On one hand, I realize it's not really a Canadian thing to name our centers after each other. I mean, If you do, God bless you. If you do, if there eventually is a Rob Nealon Center for Discipleship and Evangelism, God bless you. That's fantastic. But it's not really a Canadian thing. But even more so, as a Chinese Asian, it makes me really uncomfortable that so much focus is on me as an individual. And so, how do I process that? How do I think about that? I'm not going to quit this job. I actually kind of like the job, but I have to process, hey, where am I in terms of that discomfort, and how do I process that, and how do I portray myself in this role with this organization? And another way to think about it too is just in terms of boss and hierarchy, working relationships, or even in the church, right? So on the left side, the boss is one of us. He's the same equal person as we are. We'll call him, Frank and Robert and Steve and Carol. Whereas in Asian culture, no. It's reverend. It's chief director. It's president. There's always this step between because of the hierarchical sense of title and how leadership is seen. This one is talks about opinion. And opinion is that idea of, when we are talking about something and trying to get a point across. In the West, quite often what is lifted up as the way to express your opinion is to get to the point, get right to the point, and don't give me all this fluff stuff. Just get right to the point. If you're going to talk about anything else that has nothing to do with the point, don't talk about it, right? Whereas in Eastern culture, what Yang Liu was observing was that people talk a little bit about this, they talk a little bit about this, they talk over here, and they talk around like this, and it seems like they're not really making sense. But at the end of the conversation, the point is very clear, and the point is very clear between the two parties that are conversing and talking with one another, right? Taking this a little bit further, when we think about emotion and the expression of emotion, in the West, Yang Liu was observing that, if you're feeling sad inside or angry, well, yeah, show it. You should be free to express how you're feeling. You should tell everyone that you're not feeling good and you're very upset about things. But in Eastern culture, and in many Eastern cultures, and I am generalizing here very much so, if you're not feeling well inside, you don't really tell people. You kind of keep it in, which sounds a little bit, oppressive, but on many levels, hey, this is how we work together. We're not here just to talk about, your feelings or how you're doing. In fact, I think it's a little bit of a myth when people talk about Chinese culture and they say, oh, well, how do you greet people? Oh, we say, how are you doing? In Chinese culture, you don't say, how are you doing? When Chinese people actually meet each other and greet each other, the first thing they usually say to each other is, have you eaten yet? They don't ask, how are you? They say, have you had lunch yet? Have you had rice yet? Have you, what have you eaten? That's the first word of greeting, because for face value, to save face, you show that everything is fine. You don't talk about your deeper emotions in every relationship and in every context. That doesn't mean you never share how you're feeling. It just means when you greet somebody for the first time, you don't come out and say, I'm really angry about, whatever happened just now. Pushing that a little bit further even is, when we talk about truth, and Yang Liu observed that when we talk about truth, there's almost a dichotomy, in the West, if somebody's thinking here, and she's illustrating here, obviously, if someone says and thinks apple, well, then they're going to say apple, because clearly that's the truth and those are the facts. Whereas in some Eastern cultures, they may be thinking pear, but they'll say apple, but they're actually thinking a pear because an apple and a pear are both fruit. And so to them, it doesn't matter about the exact details and specifics of what it is. Well, it's just fruit. Yeah, I'm not telling a lie. I'm saying fruit. And that's obviously making a very small point about certain things, but that really stretches how people communicate and stretches how people, will talk about the facts, because in some other cultures, the facts are less important than the actual relationship. Now, let me take this a little bit further in terms of, well, beyond just these illustrated diagrams and, somewhat comedic illustrations and points. Well, how does that play out in terms of actual work relationships, pastoral relationships, church relationships? One way that we kind of quantify or evaluate cultural values, one easy way working together is just around time. So here's an illustration around time, where some cultures just have a very strong structured time, and they've always generationally had a very strong sense of what time is and when something starts and when something ends. Whereas other cultures may have a much more flexible idea of how time is seen. We do some training with some German students every year, and they'll tell me stories about in Berlin, if you take public transit, and I don't know what town or city you have, or if you have subways or trains or buses, but public transit in Berlin, if it's 5 minutes late, you can ask for your money back. Now, I don't know what public transit in the town or city that you're in, but if the Toronto Transit Commission is 5 minutes late, we're pretty excited that it even showed up. All right. So that's a Western paradigm of thinking about things. But in Germany, you can ask for your money back for 5 minutes. And that is very much represented by a very structured sense of time for Germans. And this is very much not just about, well, when things start, but when things end as well. I think for myself, as being not a little bit, I mean, born in Canada, I was educated in Canada. I think I have a pretty structured sense of time. I was leading the songs on Sunday, and we were up against the start time of the World Cup soccer game, and I felt uncomfortable about wanting to lead the response song, but I really wanted to lead the response song. But I had this inner struggle of saying, no, we got to end at a certain time because our service needs to be, 1 hour and 10 minutes. And if it's any longer than that, it just feels uncomfortable. Whereas in some other cultures, it's not just about the start time, but when things will end. So we have a number of Tamil churches in the Toronto area, and they routinely go beyond an hour and 10, an hour and 20, 2 hours, 3 hours. Their services typically in Toronto are about 4 hours long. And they don't just sit there. They go in and out, grabbing food, coming back, praying, worship, go back out, come back in. But it's a 4-hour service. Probably I'm being even, modest about that too. They spend the entire day together because they want to be together. And for them, that flexibility of time is much more important than actually getting the task done. I bring this up to even just push the idea that, hey, it's beyond just these nice ideas about pictures and fruits and stuff like that, but we can actually culture map. We can map how cultures see things and how they interact with one another. One of the culture maps that is pretty popular out there is by an author and researcher named Erin Meyer. And she goes through everything from communication styles to leadership to decision making, disagreement and conflict, to evaluation and scheduling, which is the time parameter there. And we can actually take cultures and say, hey, what are those cultural values that are underneath the surface that actually come and rise to the surface when we start interacting with one another? And it is kind of neat to talk about culture mapping, to say, hey, okay, but we're a Canadian culture. Well, yeah, but many of us, because of our generational backgrounds, have a Canadian culture that is very much influenced. In the Southern Ontario area, we have a good number of Reformed communities, and this is not a denominational war, but as we talk to them further and do some training, they realize, oh yeah, all of us happen to be Dutch Reformed. And all of us actually have very strong Dutch values in terms of how we see things, how we work together. For example, Dutch community and Dutch culture is very individualistic, much like Canadian culture. And it's still kind of a running joke, but not far from the truth, that upon high school graduation, the running joke is that oftentimes the parents, their gift to their high school graduate child is luggage, because you've graduated high school, it's time to move out, right? And so that individualism and idea of self-autonomy is a cultural value that's continued to be pervasive in that community 3, 4, 5 generations down. And so when we think about these cultures, it's not just about completely far or completely near. Some cultures can be the same in some categories, but very different in others. Erin Meyer is one good resource out there that is pretty good in terms of the business world that we talk about. Another culture map that I want to present at least and show you is one by another researcher named Gert Hofstede, which I personally prefer in terms of how I wrestle with categories and values. Power distance, individualism, collectivism, uncertainty and avoidance, masculinity, femininity. There is not a gender conversation. It's more about task versus relationship. But those are the academic terms that they were using. But let me kind of go through a few of these and how they relate to the church as an aid. When we think about the global church having cultural values that may be different than ours, well, how does that portray itself? So the first one, for example, when we think about power distance, I mean, that's portrayed in that image that Yang Yilu had of, the boss having a certain power and certain status over the rest of the workers. A quick definition of power distance is the extent to which less powerful members of an organization and institution accept and expect that power is distributed equally, right? So when we think about that, that distribution is very, very different all around the world. And when we think about power, I mean, there is a power distance world map, that we can actually equate and see where power is valued in different places. So the darker the green, the higher the power, the higher the power distance is, whereas the lighter the color, the lower the power distance is. So as you can see, in North America, in Canada and the US at least, it's kind of a light green, and because we very much encourage people to, call me Tim. Don't call me, Reverend Dr. Tim Tang, which is what the Chinese congregation calls me. But if, I very much welcome people. Call me by my first name. Call me by, Bob or whatever it is. Like, I'm very casual about titles and how people relate to us. And yet in other countries and in other church communities, that would be, you're basically asking them to sin by asking them to call you by their first name. We often joke that the senior pastor in a Korean church is like the fourth part of the Trinity, but he really almost is. Like, in terms of the authority that he has, when he makes a decision, it's a decision. When the senior pastor of one of the local churches here, when he calls me on my phone, first of all, I'm surprised he has my phone number, but when he calls me on the phone, it doesn't matter what meeting I'm in, I will walk out of the meeting to answer his phone, because there's this certain reverence and respect that happens, and he expects it on some level, which, for any of you who are pastors here, it's kind of like, oh, I should go work in a Korean church, right? But on the other hand, it's very lonely at the top. It's very lonely for some of those ministers who are acting in that senior role. But the perspective of leadership is very different. And how do we think about that? So in terms of discipleship, as an example, the centrality of the pastor as the teacher and leader is crucial. And so when we think about discipleship, hey, who lays, what is our biblical mandate around this or that? Whatever the senior pastor says, this is what we will do in a high powered distance. When we talk about individualism, collectivism, I referred a little bit earlier about, me being part of the Tim Center and the discomfort around that. But it's more than just inflation of self or deflation of self. It is very much more of a I versus we mentality. So on the high side of this dimension, the individualism side, there's a preference for autonomy. Dutch Reformed, very much here. Here's your suitcase. You're on your own now. You're 18. My son turns 18 next week, so I'm wondering if I should jokingly give him some suitcases and see how he reacts. Whereas high collectivist cultures like Filipino culture, when you get married, it's assumed that you move into the home. It's assumed that you move into the home. We think biblically around that. When Jesus says, I'm going ahead to prepare a room for you, and my Father's house has many rooms, that's a very high collectivist culture and value that Jesus is actually explaining. He's not just saying, oh, heaven's got a lot of rooms like a big hotel. No, it's like we're inviting you into the home as the bride of Christ. And so how do we think about that when we think about values and church? For churches that have a very high collectivist view, harmony, conformity, unity is crucial. I mean, nobody would say I'm against unity, but the definition of unity is very, very different. In the Chinese church, as an example, which is high collectivist, maybe not as high as some Filipino churches that I've seen, but in Chinese churches, it's almost better for someone to leave the faith completely than to leave our church to go to another church. Does that make sense? Like that, like no one would explicitly say that, but there's almost a discomfort when somebody says, oh yeah, I left the church and I'm going here now. You have a discomfort with that because of that collectivist feel of, oh, you've left us. Whereas if someone just said, I don't really believe in God anymore, you're almost okay with that more so than them leaving to join another collective. I don't know if that resonates with anybody, but that's very high in terms of Chinese collectivist culture. The last cultural paradigm that maybe I want to bring out, just to kind of to poke the bear, to say to say the least, is around conflict. I hope that's okay. When I think about conflict in the West, very much we're kind of taught, well, deal with conflict head on. Talk about where you are, talk about the problem, talk to the person. That's how we deal with conflict. But in many cultures, in many Eastern cultures, you don't talk to the person right on who has offended you. You talk to a mediator. You talk to somebody else. You seek counsel from someone else, not to spread gossip, but because that's just what you do. I think sometimes we have this misperception that, what's the biblical mandate around resolving conflict? And I wouldn't say that Matthew 18 is wrong in any way. And Matthew 18 is typically the go-to passage for resolving conflict. But it's not the only passage in the Bible that talks about conflict. It's actually not. It is the go-to method. And being Canadian born and educated, and I went to seminary here in Toronto as well. I mean, I was always taught Matthew 18 is the only way to resolve conflict. But it's actually not. And there's conflict all through the Bible, and multiple different ways are actually advocated for and spoken of and illustrated all through the text. Even on some level, and I don't want to get into a big theological debate about this. I mean, if you really think about it, I mean, man has sinned against God. And so from a divine theological, triune level of discussion, should not God just come directly to man and say, you've sinned against me? But what does God do? God sends his son as a mediator. And so if anything, God has actually worked in a very indirect method, even in reconciliation with humanity. That may be really stretching, and I'm really poking the discomfort here for some people, I think, right? But intentionally to say, hey, when we think about resolving conflict, hey, what are our biases when we think about certain scriptures? Are there other ways to think about it that aren't necessarily not biblical or not right, but there may be different ways of thinking about this depending on the culture that you're from. Let me kind of start bringing this to a close, and a quote that comes from Leslie Newbegin really resonates me and has resonated with me for a long time now. Leslie Newbegin was a missionary from England to India, spent many years there, and has written extensively about that cultural contrast that he experienced and continues to process. And this is what he writes: "My Christianity was syncretistic, but so was theirs. Yet neither of us could discover that without the challenge of the other. Such is the situation in cross-cultural mission. The gospel comes to the Hindu embodied in the form given to it by the culture of the missionary. As second and third and later generations of Christians make their own explorations in scripture, they will begin to test the Christianity of the missionaries in the light of their own reading of the scripture. So the missionary, if he is at all awake, finds himself as I did in a new situation. He becomes, as a bearer of the gospel, a critic of his own culture. He finds there the Archimedean point. He sees his own culture with the Christian eyes of a foreigner, and the foreigner can see what the native cannot see." Love that quote by Leslie Newbegin, just talking about, hey, we need people who are different than us to see things that perhaps we're not seeing. And so the need for ministering across cultures isn't just to spread the gospel. That is certainly part of it for those who are not, believers of Jesus. But for those who are believers of Jesus, is there a place for us to bring more awareness to our own cultural biases? As we think about the nations coming together, is it just about evangelism at our doorstep? I think that's very important. We've created apps and resources, and that we think that this is something that we need to continue to do. But as we think about the nations at our doorstep, hey, are there other conversations beyond just evangelism that perhaps discipleship we need to learn from, that perhaps will bring to light our own awareness of our own cultural biases and our own cultural awareness of how we see things that perhaps are a little bit incomplete? And so how do we see the full picture of God? As I think about where we are today, and exciting about Canada at least has one more game, beyond just the World Cup, is in 4 years' time, the FIFA World Cup will be coming to Canada, United States, and Mexico. And this makes me think about moving towards the future. Hey, what's the future that we're moving towards? Obviously, not everything ends at 2026. I hope not. Well, maybe I hope that Jesus comes back then. That'd be nice too. But when we think about moving towards the future, literally the nations are coming here. The nations are literally coming in 2026 and continue to come and have been coming and will continue to come past 2026. Well, what is the picture of Jesus that we're seeing or that we're portraying? Is it a picture of Jesus that we've conjured up because of the 5 books on our shelf that we think Jesus looks like? Or are we open to the idea that God has been active in our world from literally the beginning of time, and has been working globally in the global south, in the sub-Saharan Africa, in Asia, as well as here? And so how do we think more broadly than that? Let me end off with a small, if I can here, find my mouse here, with a video.
This is like the hottest group of 10, you guys look like U of T's football team. Show people your face. White dude, white t-shirt, long hair on the left with the glasses. You look like what white people think Jesus looks like in their dreams. And I am what you look like in reality. Your imagination lacks sense.
what I love what he says at the end, and it's a comedian, he's not a theologian, he's not a pastor. I hope you feel okay with that. But I love what he says at the end, that your imagination lacks sense. When we imagine the face of Jesus, will our imaginations lack sense? Will our imaginations be so narrow to think about who Jesus is and who Jesus is that we're portraying to the world? Or will we have an imagination, have a creativity, have a reality that the face of Jesus is not mine, but ours together to look at? Thank you so much for your time. I think I'm going to hand back the time to Rob or Garth, and I think there's going to be some time for questions as well.